December 7th. For many Americans, this date is inextricably linked to the tragic events of Pearl Harbor, but in 1988, December 7th became the epitome of a nightmare for another family. Amid the pre-Christmas hustle and bustle in Los Angeles, while the film set of Lethal Weapon 2 was preparing for another day of shooting, a deathly silence reigned in an inconspicuous suburban house. Bob Samuels, a passionate camera assistant, husband, and father, was supposed to be packing his bag for work, but he would never see the light of day again. On that day, Bob Samuels was found dead in his own home, brutally murdered. What initially appeared to be a robbery soon turned out to be something much darker, a cold-blooded crime. The woman who spoke to investigators in tears was the same woman who would later make national headlines as the Green Widow, Mary Ellen Samuels. The story begins in a typical Californian suburban idyll. Bob grew up in modest circumstances, surrounded by orange groves. He developed a passion for photography at an early age and soon found work in the film industry. Hard-working, reliable, well-liked. Only his personal life didn't seem to be going well until he ran into Mary Ellen Gurney, the prettiest girl in school, his unattainable childhood sweetheart. Years later, the two met again. She was divorced, a single mother with her daughter Nicole. He was charming, successful, ready for a family. The relationship began like a fairy tale. They married in 1980, Bob adopted Nicole, and Mary Ellen moved into his house in the San Fernando Valley. But life there was not what she had expected. There were no red carpets, no spotlights, just everyday life. Bob tried everything to make his wife happy. He even opened a sandwich shop for her so she would have something to do. But Mary Ellen was bored. She didn't want to make sandwiches. She wanted to be desired. Soon she started going to parties, meeting new men, and dressing provocatively. Her daughter, Nicole, quickly became part of this new world. Clubs, alcohol, revealing clothes. Mother and daughter became a team more interested in attention than morality. Mary Ellen used men as she saw fit. Her marriage to Bob slowly but surely fell apart. In 1986, she moved out, took Nicole with her, lived off Bob's money, and was already planning her next move. Because Bob was now thinking about divorce. For Mary Ellen, that would have been a financial disaster. Being a widow, on the other hand, would pay off. But you don't commit murder alone. Mary Ellen looked for a tool and found it in a young man in love who didn't understand how much he was being manipulated, and so a deadly plot unfolded. On the evening of December 7th, 1988, Bob Samuels returned home tired from work. He undressed, got into the shower, unaware that this would be his last evening. When he came out of the bathroom, he was taken by surprise. A hard blow with the butt of a rifle struck him on the head. Bob fell to the floor, unconscious but still alive. The killer placed a pillow over Bob's face, pressed it tightly against his head, and pulled the trigger. The shot was muffled, stifled by the fabric. Bob Samuels died in the hallway of his own home just 2 months after his 40th birthday. To cover up the crime, the apartment was ransacked in a hurry. Drawers were torn out, objects thrown on the floor. It looked like a break-in, but to trained eyes, it was clear that the chaos had been staged and nothing of value was missing. After Bob Samuels' murder, Mary Ellen's life seemed, at first glance, to be a complete success. She was a grieving widow with a bulging bank account, living in her murdered husband's house, and with no qualms about flaunting her new wealth. The investigators had a bad feeling but no evidence. Mary Ellen seemed to have committed the perfect crime, a murder that looked like a botched burglary, staged by an inexperienced perpetrator who had vanished into thin air. But the story wasn't over yet. Jimmy Bernstein, who had sacrificed himself for Nicole and believed he had to protect her, began to have doubts after the murder. He became increasingly restless. The young man felt that he had been used, and he was right. Nicole had turned her back on him, and Mary Ellen showed no interest in him anymore. Bernstein had blood on his hands, no girlfriend, and no prospects. He began to drop hints to friends, acquaintances, neighbors, and Mary Ellen heard about it. The danger that Jimmy would go to the police was real. Mary Ellen understood immediately. This loose thread had to be cut before everything threatened to come to light. Her next plan was as cold-blooded as the first. This time, she didn't want to be at the center of it all. She persuaded two men from her daughter's circle to take care of Jimmy's murder. One of them was Paul Gall, a young man with financial problems and a personal score to settle with Bernstein. His brother had died from drugs that Jimmy had sold him. Mary Ellen knew Paul's weak spot. She promised him money, played on his feelings of guilt, and convinced him that Bernstein deserved to die. Paul's friend Darrell Edwards also got involved. To calm their nerves, the two drank several bottles of beer before the crime. The plan was simple. Bernstein was to be lured into a car and strangled. Mary Ellen provided the car. Jimmy believed he was on his way to steal drugs with the two of them, but death awaited him in the passenger seat. When the first attempt failed and Bernstein tried to defend himself, he was brutally beaten and finally strangled with bare hands. They threw his body into a remote pond, and his ID papers were later carelessly discarded on the street. It took the police almost a month to find the body. When they searched Bernstein's apartment, they found clues linking him to the murder of Bob Samuels. Even more explosive, Bernstein had taken out a life insurance policy the day after Bob's death, with Nicole Samuels as the sole beneficiary. The investigation now gained momentum. The discovery of Jimmy Bernstein's body brought movement to a case that had previously been at a dead end. Investigators determined that Bernstein and Mary Ellen Samuels had been more than just casual acquaintances. Initial clues pointing to a possible murder plot came to light, but the crucial piece of the puzzle that connected everything was still missing. The turning point came thanks to a mistake. One of the two men who had killed Bernstein, Paul Gall, was not careful enough. He bragged about his crime to those around him, talking about money and revenge. An acquaintance anonymously contacted the police, who then placed Gall under surveillance and eventually arrested him. During questioning, Gall broke down after a short time. He told them about Mary Ellen, her hatred of Bernstein, and the promises she had made. Above all, he told them about the car she had provided. When investigators visited Mary Ellen again, she was no longer a grieving widow. There was a new sports car in her garage, and the house was furnished with expensive furniture. She had changed her appearance. Bleached hair, beauty treatments, flashy jewelry. Rumors circulated in the neighborhood about parties, loud music, and constant visits from young men. Mary Ellen enjoyed the limelight, and she knew she was provoking people. The police questioned her about her relationship with Bernstein. Mary Ellen acted surprised and denied any connection, but she had lost control. The investigators had Gall, they had Darrell Edwards, they had clues, and then they stumbled upon the life insurance policy. Two policies totaling $500,000, taken out a few months before Bob Samuels' death, signed by Mary Ellen. The case took on a new dimension in the media. The story of the Green Widow, as she was soon dubbed, made headlines. One image in particular made the rounds in the press. Mary Ellen, casually reclining on a bed of banknotes, a glass of champagne in her hand. It had been taken at one of her parties, and now became a symbol of a woman who was willing to stop at nothing to get what she wanted. In the spring of 1989, Mary Ellen Samuels was arrested. She was accused of inciting the murder of her husband and of being an accomplice in the murder of Jimmy Bernstein. Her daughter Nicole was also questioned, but she remained silent. Now of legal age, she refused to make any statement. The charges were clear, but the defense tried everything to portray Mary Ellen as a victim of domestic violence. It was a game of emotions, memories, and tears. But the evidence was overwhelming. Money transfers, witness statements, the life insurance policy, and her own greed. The trial of Mary Ellen Samuels began in the spring of 1990, amid intense media attention. People lined up outside the courthouse in Van Nuys to catch a glimpse of the woman who was now considered the epitome of the cold, calculating widow in California. Newspapers called her the Green Widow. Her appearance in court was carefully staged: expensive suits, understated makeup, a facial expression somewhere between innocence and superiority. The prosecution focused on establishing a clear motive: money, a need for attention and power. They called witnesses who had seen Mary Ellen at her parties, including young men she had wooed with gifts, alcohol, and promises. Particularly damning was the testimony of a former friend of Jimmy Bernstein, who recounted how Mary Ellen had deliberately manipulated young, unstable men in order to use them. Central to the trial was the photo showing Mary Ellen a few days after her husband's death, smiling, surrounded by money, with a champagne glass in her hand. The prosecution used it skillfully. A picture said more than 1,000 words. The jury appeared shaken when the photo was shown. The discrepancy between the alleged pain of a widow and this openly displayed decadence was too obvious. Mary Ellen's defense tried to paint a different picture. They presented her as a woman who had been trapped in an abusive marriage and had suffered psychological abuse for years. However, there was no evidence of violence in the relationship. Friends and colleagues of Bob Samuels described him as a quiet, loving man who sincerely loved his family. The question of how far Mary Ellen had gone in staging her innocence was also central to the case. The police reconstructed how she had left messages on Bob's answering machine to give the impression that she knew nothing about the murder. It was an almost movie-worthy script she had written, but it was no longer convincing. On the 5th day of the trial, Paul Gall took the stand. In handcuffs and under heavy guard, he described how Mary Ellen had contacted him through a middlewoman. He spoke of cash in envelopes, of promised protection, of a planned third murder if necessary. It was a harrowing picture, and it showed Mary Ellen for what she really was. Not just a perpetrator, but the driving force behind a web of lies, manipulation, and violence. The prosecution concluded its argument with a sentence that stuck. She wanted a new life, but without witnesses. The jury retired, and just 3 hours later, the verdict was in. Guilty on all counts. Mary Ellen Samuels was sentenced to death. California had not sentenced a woman to death in years. Now she was one of the few. But while the world outside looked at her with outrage or fascination, she showed no remorse. Her face remained expressionless. No tears, no wavering. Nicole Samuels, her daughter, had been absent throughout the trial. Her name was only mentioned in passing. No one knew what had become of her, whether she had turned her back on her family or simply wanted to forget. After Mary Ellen Samuels' conviction, there was no peace. The case had shaken the entire country. But the investigation was not over yet. Paul Gall, the hitman Mary Ellen had later hired, was now himself in custody. During his interrogations, he revealed details that painted an even darker picture. Gall claimed that Mary Ellen had not only recruited him, but had instructed him with frightening matter-of-factness to also eliminate Jimmy Bernstein, her original accomplice. She feared that Jimmy would sooner or later go to the police with the truth. It was not an emotional decision, but a purely strategic one. The police later found handwritten notes in Gall's apartment with timetables, addresses, and even a rough escape route. It was almost naive how carelessly Gall had left his traces behind. But it was also an expression of how much he had relied on Mary Ellen's promise that she would protect him, that she would take care of him. But when he came under suspicion, all contact broke off. Mary Ellen refused to make any statement about him. Gall was left standing alone and finally collapsed under the pressure of the police. The public reacted with horror to this turn of events. The fact that Mary Ellen had not only killed her husband, but also the young man who had carried out the murder, made her, in the eyes of many, a symbol of a cold-hearted, manipulative character. Newspapers reprinted the photo, this time with the caption, "She laughed while others died." Legally, however, the second crime had little impact. Mary Ellen had already been sentenced to death. For the prosecution, however, it was an important piece of the puzzle in showing the extent of her behavior. The double standard with which she played the grieving victim on the one hand and coldly killed, or had killed, on the other. In the years that followed, Mary Ellen remained in prison in California. Her appeals failed. Her lawyers tried to have her sentence commuted, but to no avail. Her cell was small and sparse, but decorated with pictures from fashion magazines. Even in prison, she tried to stage herself. She gave few interviews, remained vague, and avoided any direct responsibility. Mary Ellen Samuels spent her days in a California women's prison in a cramped room that had little to do with the life she had once dreamed of. The glittering world of Hollywood was far away, the glamour forgotten. What remained was the image of a woman who had two lives on her conscience and showed no remorse. The particularly well-known photograph was published in all the media. Mary Ellen, smiling, lying on the bed, surrounded by bundles of cash, a glass of champagne in her hand. The press gave her a name that stuck, the Green Widow. Green like the money that meant more to her than any life.